Have you ever heard someone talking, but your brain just starts buffering instead of taking it in? Or when someone says, "I literally just told you," but you're still trying to process the first sentence. Perhaps you've experienced that awkward moment when you say, "What?" and understand them before they repeat themselves. If so, you might be experiencing auditory processing disorder. So let's talk about it. Welcome or welcome back. I'm Rosie. Hi. I'm a disabled UK-based counsellor specialising in supporting disabled, neurodiverse and chronically ill people with their mental health. Alongside private counselling, I make these videos as well to offer psychoeducation and support, particularly for people who aren't able to access counselling right now. These videos aren't a replacement for counselling, but I hope they can give you some practical tools, a bit of reassurance, and a reminder that you're not alone. Today, we're talking about auditory processing disorder, often shortened to APD. It's one of those conditions that many people have never heard of until they or someone they love is diagnosed. Even among healthcare professionals, teachers, and employers, awareness can be surprisingly limited, which unfortunately means that people spend many years misunderstanding their own experiences. So today I want to explain what APD actually is, what it isn't, why it can be so exhausting, and most importantly, how we can begin supporting ourselves instead of blaming ourselves. So let's start with the obvious question. What actually is auditory processing disorder? One of the biggest misconceptions is that APD is a hearing problem. For many people, it is not. Someone with APD may pass standard hearing tests with completely normal results. Their ears are detecting sounds perfectly well. The difficulty comes afterward, when the brain has to organize, interpret, and make sense of the information. An analogy I often use is email. Imagine your ears are simply collecting emails throughout the day. Someone without APD has a brain that quickly sorts those emails into folders, marks important ones, gets rid of spam, and responds efficiently. For someone with APD, those emails all arrive at once, with no folders, and several of them partially obscured. They're still there, but organizing them takes much more effort. Or it might be helpful to imagine you're trying to tune an old-fashioned radio. For anybody under 30, this one may be less useful, but bear with me. You're turning the dial, and you know there's a conversation happening somewhere in all the static, but the signal keeps fading in and out. You catch some words, miss others, and spend a lot of energy filling in the gaps. That's closer to what many people describe. Of course, everyone's experience is slightly different. Some people struggle mainly with background noise. Others find rapid speech incredibly hard. Some struggle to tell different sounds apart. Others find following lengthy verbal instructions almost impossible. Like many neurodevelopmental conditions, APD exists on a spectrum of experiences rather than looking exactly the same for everyone. One thing I think is really important to say early on is this. APD is not a measure of intelligence. People with APD are no less intelligent than other people. They're not careless. They're not ignoring you. Their brain is simply processing information differently. Unfortunately, because listening looks effortless from the outside, people often assume that if someone doesn't understand them, they simply weren't paying attention. But listening and processing are not the same thing. You can hear every sound perfectly while struggling to understand what those sounds mean. That's an important distinction. One experience I hear about again and again is people asking them to repeat themselves. You've probably had this happen. Someone says something, you immediately reply, "Sorry, what?" Or "Can you please repeat that?" They begin repeating themselves, and halfway through, your brain suddenly catches up. "Oh, never mind, I got it." Sometimes people laugh about this, but it's actually a really common APD experience. The information was not absent. Your brain simply needed another second or two to process it. That delay can be incredibly frustrating for you because from the outside it looks inconsistent. People may wonder whether you understood them after all. You may even wonder yourself. But processing time is a valid need. Our brains don't all work at exactly the same speed, particularly under different environmental demands. And speaking of environmental demands, let's talk about background noise. For many people with APD, background noise isn't just annoying, it's overwhelming or overstimulating. Imagine trying to read a book while somebody continually waves another page in front of your face, or trying to complete a crossword while somebody shouts random words right next to you. It's a little bit what it's like when someone's brain is struggling to filter competing sounds. Most brains automatically decide what's important: the person speaking to you, your name being called, the teacher giving instructions. Everything else is pushed into the background. With APD, that filtering system isn't always as efficient. Instead, you still hear those things, but it comes with other data too. The air conditioning, clattering plates, music, someone coughing, a conversation happening nearby. They're all competing for attention at the same time. No wonder listening becomes exhausting if that's what you're experiencing. One of the consequences of this is something people don't always expect: fatigue. Listening becomes hard work because your brain is constantly compensating to do something that wasn't necessary for the person sat in front of you, who automatically filters those sounds out. Your brain is analyzing, predicting, maybe even filling in missing words, using context clues trying to keep up, watching facial expressions, lip reading without even realizing it, trying to decide which sounds matter and which don't. I mean, even listing that out, that is so much energy going into trying to keep pace. That level of concentration burns a huge amount of mental energy. Many adults with APD describe arriving home after work completely exhausted, even if their job was not physically demanding. Anyone spending long periods listening may find themselves completely depleted by the end of the day. If you've ever wondered why socializing feels so draining, APD might be part of the answer. People often assume social fatigue means someone is shy or antisocial. Sometimes it simply means their brain has been processing spoken language for hours without a break. And that's hard for anyone to do, but particularly so for people with APD. Another thing worth talking about is inconsistency. One day you understand everything perfectly. The next you can't seem to follow a simple conversation. Oh, that inconsistency can be deeply confusing for the person experiencing that fluctuation. You start asking yourself, why was I fine yesterday? Why can everybody else do this? Am I just not trying hard enough? And usually the answer is no. Many different factors affect auditory processing: fatigue, stress, pain, sensory overload, the acoustics of the room, whether someone is facing you, how quickly they're speaking, whether you already understand the topic or if it's new, or even how many people are involved. Even something as simple as having a headache can significantly increase processing difficulties. I also want to touch on childhood, because many adults aren't diagnosed until much later in life. A child with APD might get lots of labels put on them, like dreamy, distracted, forgetful, slow to follow instructions. Teachers may notice that they ask for repetition. Parents may wonder why their child seems to hear the television perfectly but misses conversations. The child themselves often has no idea anything is different. They simply know that everyone else seems to understand things much faster. Sadly, many children internalize those messages. It becomes less "I'm struggling" and more "I'm stupid," or "I'm lazy," or "I'm always getting things wrong." Those beliefs can last well into adulthood. Sometimes the biggest impact of APD isn't the listening difficulties themselves, it's years of believing you're somehow inadequate. That's why diagnosis, whether it's formal or simply recognizing your own experiences, can be incredibly validating. It doesn't change who you've always been, or even the ongoing difficulty of it. It simply gives you an explanation. Understanding ourselves better means that we can start giving ourselves the right tools. It's worth mentioning diagnosis briefly because people often ask about it. Diagnosing APD isn't always straightforward. Assessment usually involves specialist audiology services rather than a standard hearing test, because the aim isn't to measure whether you can hear sounds. It's about understanding how your brain processes them. So depending on where you live, access to assessment can unfortunately be quite limited, and waiting lists may be long. Some people therefore spend years recognizing themselves in descriptions of APD before having a formal assessment. Whether or not someone has a diagnosis, though, the practical strategies that support auditory processing can still be incredibly helpful. So let's talk about those briefly. The first is reducing unnecessary background noise wherever possible. Obviously, we can't always control our environment, but small adjustments can make a surprisingly big difference. Putting in earplugs, turning the television off during conversations, choosing quieter cafes, closing a door, even sitting with your back to a noisy room rather than facing it can help. The second strategy is asking for information in more than one format. If something is important, don't rely solely on verbal instructions. Ask for an email or take notes. Many workplaces are already moving towards written summaries after meetings because they're useful for everyone, not just people with APD. The third strategy is allowing yourself processing time. You don't have to answer immediately. It's perfectly acceptable to say, "Just give me a second to think about that." Or, "Can you repeat the last part a little more slowly?" It's not asking for special treatment. It's just asking for accessible communication. Another strategy many people find useful is reducing the amount of multitasking they do whilst listening. If somebody is explaining something important, don't scroll on your phone. Pause what you're writing. Turn towards them. Our brains have limited attentional resources, and giving auditory information your full attention can significantly improve understanding. Many people with APD also benefit enormously from subtitles. There's sometimes a stigma attached to using captions. People assume they're only for people with hearing loss. Actually, captions provide an additional visual route for processing language. There's absolutely nothing wrong with using every available tool to support your understanding. Something else I'd really like to talk about is self-compassion. Because after years of struggling, many people become incredibly self-critical. They apologize constantly. "I'm sorry, could you repeat that? Sorry, I'm not listening." Or, and I've heard this before a lot, sorry, I'm being stupid. Notice how quickly we jump to blaming ourselves. Would you speak that way with somebody else with dyslexia who needed extra time to read? Probably not. You'd simply recognize that reading works differently for them. APD deserves that same compassion. Your brain is processing information differently, and once we stop fighting that reality, we can begin working with it instead. I also think it's important to acknowledge how emotionally exhausting masking can become. Many people become experts at pretending they've understood. They nod or smile or laugh when everyone else is laughing. They piece conversations together from context and guess what was said. That takes enormous effort, and it's so tiring. Sometimes it works remarkably well. Sometimes it leads to misunderstandings that can feel embarrassing. If you've spent years doing this, you're not alone. Many people describe finally admitting that they didn't catch something as strangely liberating, because pretending to understand is often incredibly exhausting, and more so than asking for clarification. Finally, I want to leave you with something that I think is very important. Our society often values speed, quick thinking, quick responses, quick conversations. But there is a great deal of value in things that move slowly. Moving slower gives time for contemplation, and taking longer to process spoken information doesn't make your thoughts any less valuable. Needing subtitles doesn't make you any less capable. Asking someone to slow down doesn't make you difficult. Using written communication doesn't make you weak. These are adaptations, and adaptation is something human beings are remarkably good at. The goal of adaptation isn't to force your brain to work like everyone else's. The goal is to understand how your own brain works and build a life that supports it. Because once we stop treating our differences as personal failures, we create room for confidence, for self-acceptance, and genuine growth. If today's video resonated with you, I'd love to hear about your experiences in the comments. Hearing other people's stories can be incredibly validating, especially with a condition that so many people have never even heard of. If you'd like to see more videos about disability, chronic illness, neurodivergence, and mental health, don't forget to subscribe. And if you're interested in having some counselling with me, please check the description section. As always, thank you so much for watching, and take really good care.